Welcome to another episode of Grace on Repeat. Host Corey coming to you from Southern Maryland.
Morning,
My
guys.
name is
Right?
Scott coming to you from Middle Tennessee. We're starting out a new series this week. We're going to be talking about God's love. Today we're just going to focus on the foundations of God's love, how God's love is eternal, its significance for believers, and this is going to be an important topic just to help our perspective in our walk with the Lord.
Yeah, I
So
think because it's one of the things that I've always struggled with in my walk. It's been sin on my part, just doubting God's love for me. I know that's not where we're going with it in this episode, and it's one of the most important topics I think we can actually talk about is God's love. Does God love me? Because the Bible does say that those who He loves, He disciplines, and if you're not being disciplined by God, you have good cause to question, does He love me? I'm not even saying we're going to get there today with that either, but that's just kind of the areas we're going with it.
I think that stems from a core misunderstanding of how we've been conditioned to think of God. We
Yeah.
think of him in human terms, anthropomorphic terms. I know you touched on that the
Hmm.
last time we talked. And we have a tendency to view God just as in a conditional relationship aspect that we do with relationships with other people.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for us to just think about the nature of God more rightly, I would say, would help
Biblically,
us.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and I think too, if you think about it, and I have to speak from experience too, I attribute and tend to view God in light of, say, your earthly father or parent figure, whoever's raising you, that's demonstrated the most authority in your life. You equate that love that you were shown in life to by that person to God's love.
right.
Is it an authoritative love? Because my father was a strict father. You knew my dad growing up. I mean, but he was a loving dad, but he was strict, and I knew your dad. He was the same way. So, I don't know how you perceive the Lord's love, but I've always, sadly perceived the Lord as strict at times, and it's not fair to him because that's not how he is.
Yeah, it's hard to escape the conditionality of how we've been raised and in this world and our relationships with parents and authority figures. And in a lot of ways, it is a conditional type of relationship. So we'll kick it off. Let's talk about the nature of God's love as opposed to what we've been alluding to, how our
What we've been
relationships in this
taught.
world are conditional and this and that. Not to say that there's not really an unconditional type of love that we experience in the world amongst each other. It's not always reduced to just a conditional, contractual give and take type of relationship here. But
As we saw in the last episode that we were talking about the state of theology. Bad theology leads to pretty much a lot of other bad practices in your life, which could include, bad evangelism, which, we'll talk around and talk about in future episodes. But your perception of the Lord's love is contingent on how good your theology is.
yeah, that's a great point.
I
Yeah,
don't
it
know, man.
and that's really why we're talking about it today because we
Hmm.
feel like it directly ties into misconceptions of how
Yeah.
we view God, how we'll view theology, how that
Yeah.
affects our understanding of what he's done for us and
Yeah.
our responsibilities and whatnot.
Yep.
For me, just studying this, I found it really encouraging and I found it kind of eye-opening and it shed light on areas where I've been conditioned and have a tendency to view God in
Like what?
less terms, in less ways than
Like
what we
like
should
what
be.
way?
Well, thinking of God's love in not necessarily just an attribute or an emotion. It's not a human emotion for him to love,
Right.
but it's actually an essential aspect of his nature. I mean,
Hmm.
it's central to his nature and actions, and reflecting upon the eternal nature of it was really just eye-opening. There was no beginning to his love, and his love is not affected by outside variables.
Right.
Anything that his creation does, he's not reactive, and we had talked about this in past episodes where
Hmm.
God does not change.
Right.
So it's an eternal aspect of his nature. It really is his essence. First John chapter 4 verse 8 says, "Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love." So that's scripture just referring to God as love. God is love, but love is not God. So
Right.
we don't want to make the mistake of making love an idol
Right.
because then it's reducing it down to that human level.
It's important to note too that his love, it's perfectly harmonious and in full functioning all the time with his other attributes. In other words, his holiness, his justice, his wrath, his anger. You know, he's I heard MacArthur the other day say something to the effect that God is always angry. He's always wrathful, he's always just, he's always loving, he's always forgiving. You know what I mean? He's always those things all the time.
Yeah,
So the consolation for us as Christians, for those of us who follow Jesus Christ, is that his love is measured in nothing else than in the cross of Jesus Christ. That's it. There's no other parameter or measurement by which I can define or measure his love. It's all in the cross of Jesus Christ.
I think what Jesus did for us, what God did for us in providing salvation, is really the pinnacle of his gracious, merciful love. Going back to God's love being eternal and uninfluenced, it's his love is really spontaneous and uncaused. I've heard the statement that God is the uncaused cause. So it's
Mhm.
not influenced by anything within his creation. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 7 and 8 said, "The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples, but it was because the Lord loved you."
Yeah.
So God's love has no beginning or end, and it really just emanates from his eternal nature. So when
And that,
we step back and think about that, that's really not the way that we typically think about things because we are conditioned in this world within
yeah.
time frames, beginnings and ends, and it helps put things into perspective, I believe.
Romans 5:8, but God demonstrates his own love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So while we were sinners, while we were weak, while we were enemies, Christ died for us, and God was demonstrating his love for us through that death. Really, his love, in a sense, can be broken down into two components, I think, his general love and his special love. Did you want to talk about his general love a little bit, dude?
Yeah, I think the general love is what we can refer to as common grace. He sustains the universe, he sustains the world we live in, he provides a habitat and a life for everyone to experience in. And there's areas where every bit of his creation share in the common general love that God has provided through his creation.
Right.
And in regard to special love, I'll let you comment on that.
Yeah, special love is kind of like what I was just talking about earlier. It's the love that is specific and designated solely for the follower of Jesus Christ. It's a saving love. It's like the general love Scott just described. Jesus said in Matthew 5:45, for he, speaking of the Father, causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and the sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. That's because of his character, his nature. It's not conditional. It's not because of something. Well, I mean, it is. It's because of him and his character. It's just that's who he is. God is love. He cannot not love. Oh, but the special, just like I was saying, was it's just basically just the special love that God has for the believer of Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
But
and that brings up Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. It says, "For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will." Really, these are things that come out of his nature, his
mhm,
sovereign will, his purposes. I found it interesting to think about, we're talking about God's love and those things that you had mentioned earlier about how God hates sin, or
mhm,
the verse where Romans 9:13 it says, "Just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated."
mhm.
So I think it's fair to bring up the topic of what does it mean when it says God hates something as
Yeah.
opposed to his love? And after thinking about that, I realize we also have a tendency to think in terms of human emotion when it talks about God hating something.
Right.
And that's not necessarily what's happening either. Out of God's nature and his essence of being righteous, holy, loving, pure, eternal, anything that falls short of that, or that he sovereignly chooses one thing over the other, from our perspective we could
See it as
describe it
hate.
as if he hated it.
Right.
So he's choosing, and there's things that he's so committed to his righteousness and holiness that sin and those who practice sin or those who suppress the truth, it would be fair for us to just describe it as if God hates that. But
Right.
it's really not in an unbridled rage type of thing where it's just an emotion that pops up because these people are responding in a certain way. It's
And I think the proof of that is who could stand if it was fully revealed. Nobody could stand, you know.
no,
And I think that his even in his anger, it's always tempered, you know, with mercy and grace. Because if you look at, say, Cain, who murdered his brother Abel, you know, even after he murdered him, God was merciful to him, provided, you know, a mark for him or whatever it was, a sign that no one, you know, no one would kill him. All the other, you know, instances, I think you were alluding to the children of Israel earlier, you know, and if you look at Ezekiel, he has a good thing there in 16. You know, it's a whole chapter, but I'm not going to read that whole chapter. But in it, he basically details Israel's condition prior to their salvation from God. You know, that they were like a calved deer that was just abandoned, left alone in its blood. You know, and how he, you know, God nursed it back, licked it away, and the key that I took away from that was that he says there, I set my love upon you. I chose to set my love upon you. My whole point in saying that is going back to the Esau and Jacob deal is that as we see as he had mercy with Cain, despite his atrocity, we remember that, I mean, God even blessed Edom or Esau with Mount Seir, you
right.
know,
Yeah.
and I remember when the children of Israel were coming out through the Exodus, he even told them, leave that alone. That's I gave that to Edom. That's Esau's, you know.
Hmm.
You don't touch it. But I can't say just in my understanding of scriptures, I mean, honestly, that Esau, we're gonna see him in heaven. I don't think we will.
Yeah, I'm
I
not
mean,
really sure about that. I'd have to study on that a little bit, but and we may not even know the answer to that until we
yeah,
get there. But
we may not, but I mean, just from what I can see, you know, just in my limited understanding, I mean, I don't think we'll see him. I mean, I think what the Lord said in that verse, he absolutely meant, and it was for a purpose. His purpose to show grace to vessels of mercy, as Paul
yeah,
says there in Romans.
and what we're talking about is a difficult subject because it does
It is.
surpass human comprehension and it defies measurement by any standard that we can come up with.
Mhm.
Ephesians chapter 3 verse 18 and 19 says, "May you have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge."
Yeah.
So it's
Hey,
something that we can't just put into a box and fully wrap our head around because it really does surpass our understanding.
no, and one of those instances that has always baffled me, and I don't know, maybe it will baffle has baffled you as well, is the rich young ruler. It says he walked away because you know, he had much possessions, but it says in there that Jesus loved him and had compassion on him.
Yeah, and if you look at what Jesus did with the rich young ruler,
Hmm.
the rich young ruler was claiming to have fulfilled the law in his own strength. And so what Jesus did was give him the first use of the law, which is here's the standard perfection. And I think the good question is will we see the rich young ruler in heaven,
Yeah,
But we don't really, I don't know, we don't have the answer to that.
we don't.
But it makes you wonder. I mean, Jesus did love him. And instead of giving him grace and the gospel in that moment, he was confronting the rich young ruler's own self-righteousness. And that was really the pattern of rebuke that we see in Jesus throughout the New Testament, is
Yeah,
rebuking those who were establishing their own righteousness, whether it was the religious leaders
yep.
or anyone claiming that they could make it to heaven by their own power.
With the rich young ruler though, I'm sitting there thinking like, you know, I'm gonna put it under the Lord generally loving him because just as you described, he was telling him the truth. You know, he told him the truth. You think you're perfect, okay, go out and be perfect. You're gonna show yourself to be false in that, and your realization is gonna be that you need me.
Yeah,
But
and the effect of the first use of the law is to really crush us in our own righteousness and to then turn to Jesus as the way
right,
for true
that's the
righteousness.
yeah, and that was the whole. the law being the tutor. It was our taskmaster, if you will, until
Yeah,
the
and there was other
freedom
people
came.
that Jesus addressed who were completely broken in their sin,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he was very merciful and graceful and
You know,
compassionate with those
I think his
individuals.
rebuke was often contingent upon how deeply entrenched one was in their self-righteousness. Because you look how he dealt with the rich young ruler. He spoke softly, it seemed, to him. I mean, sternly but softly in a sense, but it was quite different with the Pharisees.
Yeah.
There was like, you hypocrites, you brood of vipers. I mean, it was
Yeah.
getting to some stuff.
But we know whatever Jesus was doing, it was all in accordance with his sovereign plan, his sovereign will, and it wasn't necessarily as if he was bound to the reactions of humans and how he was going to respond. He was a perfect shepherd, but he was accomplishing the plan of salvation through the whole thing. I,
Absolutely.
I think the next point is just realizing that God's love is immutable, it's holy, and it's gracious.
Yeah.
So we know it's unchanging and it endures despite the frailty and sin of humanity. James chapter 1 verse 17 says, "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows."
Yeah.
I believe that brings a lot of comfort to us because let's say God was a reactionary being and that he responded to us out of, emotions and just different things that we did, we would be in a very unstable state. Because God's love is unchanging and his character is eternal, I think it brings a lot of comfort and assurance to us, and we can find a place of rest in that.
Definitely, as Christians, I mean, like I said earlier, it's all centered around, for us Christians. I mean, for the whole of creation, really, it's centered around the cross of Jesus Christ, and it's more than that. It's centered on God's, the Father's love for the Son. Jesus even asked the Lord, the Father in the high priestly prayer in John, "Love them as you loved me before the world was." He wanted the same love for us, or the same love that the Father had for him to have for us. And so everything just really centers around Jesus Christ. Everything.
Yeah, John 13:1 says, "Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved
Yeah,
them to the end."
to the end.
So we know his love is holy, it's never conflicting with his righteousness. So when God does punish or chastise or send out his wrath, we know that it doesn't conflict with his righteousness.
Mm.
We can't make the mistake of attributing some slip up emotionally to God when he's distributing his wrath.
I did a study in Romans one time, and in that, when I was doing some word study stuff on it, there in Romans 1 where it talks about his wrath being revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness. I was looking all that up, and they talked about that specifically, and those Greek words specifically denote that his anger, his wrath is fully measured. It's not erratic. It's not fly off the handle. Even the original languages stress that in that verse. His wrath is not, his anger and wrath are not like ours. Ours are unmeasured, it's unmerited, it's without bound, and oftentimes unprovoked. And that's another thing. Words anger or wrath is never without provocation. And I think it's important that we do stress this, just for the believer listening, that look forward to the discipline of Jesus Christ in your life, because that means he loves you. And if you're not being disciplined, be really afraid, in my opinion.
We see that in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 6, because the
Yeah.
Lord disciplines the one he loves,
Yep.
and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son.
Hmm. Like, is not a Christian, and I think you can attest to this, Scott, with the believers that you've met in your life, pastor or otherwise, that no one is without sin, and that no one has attained perfect sanctification. So people are going to be within our Christian life, are going to be seeing people facing discipline from the Lord, mildly, severely, whatever, however it may be. But don't assume, hey, everything's going smooth, the Lord, everything's great, and maybe it's not.
I
That's
think
why.
that flies in the face of prosperity gospel type
Yeah.
teaching, where you name
Preach.
it, claim it, and
Hmm.
live your best version of yourself. Lord deals with us as if we are his children, and we are his children as believers.
I think about that as a dad, man. You got two kids and I've had to discipline them, but never once did I discipline them because I just felt like randomly disciplining them.
Right,
And never
right.
did I discipline them because I hated them or anything like that. My discipline was always for correction and because if my son or my daughter, I love you. So shape up now. You know what I mean? But that's the Lord's love is always that way. It's always corrective. It's always Christ. It's forming Christ likeness in us. It's always leading to that. I think it's just so important that we just always first never doubt the love of God for you as a believer. Never. It's so crippling to one's walk, man, and it leads to a whole host of issues. So that is something that you need to repent of and rectify immediately. That if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, He loves you immensely. So that's what I wanted to say about it.
Yeah, and as believers, he chose us before the foundations of the world. It was not conditional based on what we do.
Right.
And so just the eternal nature of God's love ties into the eternal nature of God's salvation should bring us a deeper comprehension of his character and what he's done for us in Jesus Christ. And it's really foundational to our faith. And then understanding the eternal nature of that, it corrects misconceptions and sentimental views about divine love, revealing that he's sovereign, he's made choices. It's according to his sovereign will and purposes that
Yeah.
these things have come about, and it does not conflict with his righteousness, his holiness, and his justice, and the fact that his love is really uninfluenced, it's eternal. That really should just provide comfort and assurance to us. And especially in times when we're struggling in this world, in trial and affliction, we can
Yeah.
always go back to the rock
Right.
that we stand on in Christ, knowing that our eternal salvation is secure and we have a God who loves us. We are part of his family. We're here just to always bring it back to the cross and with the hopes of just spreading the good news of Jesus Christ.
That's the only place we can go, man, as Christians, because it's I just want to close with this, but on my end, that what Scott said is just the circumstantial stuff. We just got to get it out of our head and not even consider the circumstances we're in at all, because our circumstances don't measure or dictate whether the Lord loves us. Scott alluded to the prosperity gospel just a few minutes ago, and I always think these guys are such clowns, man. Because if you look at Paul's life, dude, that guy was beaten, shipwrecked, stoned. God had a great plan for his life, according to the prosperity gospel standard. But my point being is we just can't let our circumstances be the guidepost of does God love me? Because your circumstances may be very, very bad, but at
Yeah,
the same time, his love for you is very, very deep. And I think Spurgeon said it. I think I sent it to you this week. He says, I've learned to kiss the waves that slam me against the rock of ages. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
that's a great quote.
It is, dude.
Circumstances are temporal, they're changing, our emotions are changing. We have one that is unchanging and eternal.
Man, brother.
So
That's right. The rock.
so really today we just wanted to focus on the foundations of God's love, really just
Yeah.
of the nature of his love. And I think
Yeah.
next week we'll talk a little bit more about how God's love is manifested.
Obviously we didn't exhaust today, but it's one of those things where even what we talked about today will be brought up again. It's just one of those things. It's foundational, his love, his all his other attributes, but I think it's gonna be one of those things that we're gonna be talking about pretty consistently. But that's what I'm thinking, man.
Sounds good.